Thank you, Tammy Solonec from Amnesty International. Thank you for the opportunity to present today on behalf of Amnesty International. I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land on which we meet today, the Jagera and Turrbal people of the Greater Brisbane area. Amnesty International is the world's largest independent human rights organisation, comprising of more than 7 million supporters in more than 160 countries. We are impartial and independent of any government, political persuasion or religious belief, and accordingly, we do not receive any funding from governments or political parties. Amnesty International is a worldwide movement to promote and defend all human rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international human rights instruments, including the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Amnesty welcomed the opportunity to submit to the Queensland Productivity Commission's inquiry into imprisonment and recidivism in November last year. Our submission drew on our research since 2013 on the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in the Australian justice system, and our 2016 report heads held high, keeping Queensland out of detention. The submission also drew on the work of the Change the Record Coalition, a coalition of Indigenous and non-Indigenous organisations, and in particular the coalition's Free to Be Kids National Action Plan and the Blueprint for Change from UN treaty bodies and the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in her 2017 report. Amnesty has also conducted a series of right to information applications regarding children currently being held at the Brisbane Watch House since our submission in November last year, from which we also draw information. I'll start with the human rights framework. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is the primary source of the rights relevant to this inquiry. Unique among the major UN human rights treaties, it explicitly recognises the particular needs of Indigenous children. Relevant obligations under the Convention include that the best interests of the child is a fundamental principle to be observed, including in the context of criminal justice, that arrest and detention must be measures of last resort for children, and that a variety of appropriate alternatives to detention should be put in place to ensure that children are dealt with in a manner appropriate to their well-being and proportionate to the circumstances. Importantly, for Indigenous children, Article 2.1 of the Convention requires parties to respect and ensure the rights set forth in the Convention to each child within the jurisdiction without discrimination of any kind, irrespective of the child's parents, legal guardians, race, colour, ethnic or social origin or other status. Article 37 of the Convention provides that state parties shall ensure that the arrest, detention or imprisonment of a child shall only be used as a measure of last resort and for the shortest appropriate time period, and that every child deprived of their liberty shall be treated with humanity and respect and in a manner which takes into account the needs of the person's age, his or her age. And Article 43 requires state parties to promote the establishment of measures for dealing with children without resorting to judicial proceedings and to ensure that children are dealt with in a manner appropriate to their well-being and proportionate to the circumstances of the offence. In its general comment, number 10, on children's rights in juvenile justice, the Committee on the Rights of the Child says that a comprehensive policy for juvenile justice must deal with the prevention of juvenile delinquency, interventions without resorting to judicial proceedings, and interventions in the context of judicial proceedings. What this means in practice is set out in more detail in the United Nations Rules for the Protection of Juveniles Deprived of Their Liberty, also known as the Havana Rules. These rules include that solitary confinement or any other punishment that may compromise the physical or mental health of the child must be strictly prohibited. So this is the overarching international human rights framework governing the detention of children. Amnesty International calls on all levels of government to commit to a youth justice approach which is at all times consistent with Australia's international human rights obligations as laid out above. In addition to the general human rights principles, our key recommendations to the Queensland Government relate to children on remand, the low age of criminal responsibility, justice reinvestment and learnings from other jurisdictions. So I'll start with children on remand. Yes. A major contributing factor to imprisonment rates is the amount of young people in detention who are not sentenced, that is, those who are on remand. Queensland has the highest rates of imprisonment for unsentenced youth in Australia. On average day in 2016-17, 81% of children detained were unsentenced. This means that they haven't been through their time in court. Sometimes they haven't even had their guilt determined, and in all cases they haven't been given a final sentence. Adults are often bailed to suitable accommodation in these instances, but children without what is considered suitable accommodation are kept in watch houses and lockups. Indigenous children in Queensland spend an average of 71 days in detention on remand, compared with 50 days for non-Indigenous children. This was 3 weeks longer than the national average, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children spending 50 days, an average of 50 days, and non-Indigenous children spending 43 days in detention on remand. This situation is a serious human rights concern. During 2016-17 in Queensland, 49% of the children on remand were in pre-court detention, which was a result of police refusal of bail, and 55% of those children were Indigenous. Under Queensland law, police must notify the Aboriginal legal services before interviewing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person and allow them to speak to and have a support person during questioning. Before interviewing any child, police must similarly allow them to speak to a support person and have them present with them during the interview. There's a memorandum of understanding between the ATSLs, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Services of Queensland, and the Queensland Police Service about when ATSLs should be notified. However, these protections only apply to indictable offences. This is an important distinction, as many children are questioned, fined, arrested and detained for summary offences like public nuisance, theft or trespass. Therefore, the Memorandum of Understanding does not apply in approximately 50% of the cases. Despite this, the ATSLs still are often not notified. The Queensland Attorney-General Yvette D'Arth acknowledged that one of the reasons that there's such a high number of young people on remand in Queensland is because there is no suitable accommodation or support service for their release or on supervision. 9 additional supervised bail accommodation facilities were set to be opened in mid-2018. 5 of these facilities were not operational as of August 2018, and as we understand it, are still not operational now. Another issue is that children are regularly being charged with criminal offences whilst in supervised accommodation. The result of the criminalisation of children in these facilities is leads to their further entrenchment in the justice system. Finally, there are significant delays in processing children through the courts, which mean that they spend more time than is necessary on remand. In 2016-17, it took an average of 51 days to finalise children's proceedings in the magistrates' courts and 369 days to finalise proceedings in the children's courts. This is the longest average duration of proceedings for both courts in the past 5 years. Whilst the state recently released a Youth Justice Action Strategy, and it said that an expansion of funding for an additional specialist at the Children's Court would assist with this, it was not a new measure, and it's only a temporary commitment. So on the basis of all this, our recommendations to the Queensland Government to address the disturbing remand situation of children is as follows. First of all, that the Queensland Government extend the legislative requirement that the ATSLs be notified when Indigenous children are brought in for questioning to extend to summary offences. The second is to raise the age of criminal responsibility to at least 14. The third is to inquire into reform of the Bail Act and the Young Offenders Act. We also recommend that the Queensland Government ensure sufficient ongoing funding available to continue the work undertaken by ATSLs and the Queensland Indigenous Family Violence Prevention Legal Services, to fund culturally appropriate Indigenous community-controlled bail accommodation and support services. C, put in place systems that address the current high rates of arrests at supervised bail accommodation. D, investigate the reasons for the increasing delays in the finalisation of children's matters in the magistrates magistrates and districts courts. E, fund culturally appropriate Indigenous community-controlled bail accommodation and support services. And F, puts in place systems that address the current high rates of arrest at supervised bail accommodation. Sorry, I think I had a bit of a typo there, but I can provide the written notes. So the next area I would like to talk about is the minimum age of criminal responsibility. So the current age of criminal responsibility, that is, the age that children can be placed in detention, is 10 years old across Australia. Citing human rights, legal and medical expertise, Amnesty International has called for the minimum age of criminal responsibility to be raised to 14 years in all jurisdictions. In Queensland, if the minimum age of criminal responsibility was raised to 14 years, there would have been 15.5% fewer children imprisoned in 2016-17. Amnesty International is pleased that the Queensland Government is supporting the federal review on the age of criminal responsibility through the Council of Attorney-General's Working Group. We challenge the government to show leadership, and when this report is released, and be the government that takes the lead in raising the age. We have produced a publication called The Sky is the Limit, and there are many reasons in that, but due to the time limits, I think we have given enough evidence previously about raising the age, so I'll move on to the next issue, which is health and cognitive development. So children often do not understand the consequences of their actions, meaning that they are being imprisoned for actions that they might not be responsible for. This is even worse for children who have brain injuries, development impairments, mental health issues and psychological issues, including fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or FASD. So FASD relates to a spectrum of disabilities, including physical, cognitive, intellectual, learning, behavioural, social and executive functioning abnormalities and problems with communicating, motor skills, attention and memory. It can result in a range of difficulties for children, such as difficulties in understanding cause and effect, learning from past experiences and decision making. A recent study of the Banksia Hill Detention Centre in Western Australia found that 1 in 3 children in the prison had FASD, and that 9 out of 10 had some form of neurodevelopmental disorder. Similarly, a New South Wales study of children in 8 prisons found that 45.8% had borderline or lower intellectual functioning. These are vulnerable children. Health issues can also lead to young people being in the justice system. Acute otitis media, glue ear or runny ear can cause long-term hearing loss if they're not treated and lead to delayed language development, poor auditory perception and interpersonal problems in young children. The ongoing effects of hearing issues are seen in behavioural problems, educational underperformance, school dropout and illiteracy, which leads to underemployment and involvement in criminal activity in the justice system. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children have ear diseases at 2.9 times the rate of their non-Indigenous population and are much more likely to have contact with the justice system than their non-Indigenous peers. Measures such as school screening, general practitioner hearing checks, auditory screening, specialist treatment and education for families and schools in prevention and treatment could reduce the crippling effect of chronic ear disease and the rate children come into contact with the justice system. Furthermore, when testing in contact with the justice system, testing when in contact with the justice system should occur to ensure children are not being penalised for medical issues. The next issue I would like to talk about is justice reinvestment. Justice reinvestment is a system reform that is slowly being adopted throughout the nation. Justice reinvestment is an evidence-based approach to reducing incarceration rates by investing in and supporting communities to address the underlying social issues leading to offending. The approach was developed in the United States as a means of curbing spending on corrections and reinvesting savings from this reduced spending in strategies that can decrease crime and strengthen neighbourhoods. In contrast to the United States, however, justice reinvestment in Australia has largely been a community-driven process. The Marinuka and Burke Tribal Council have led the Marinuka Justice Reinvestment Project since 2013 in New South Wales in partnership with Just Reinvest. Justice reinvestment in Burke has focused on coordination and partnership between community service providers, governments and police. This has led to the Burke Warrant clinic, a support network of young people, including not-for-profit workers and government officials from family, education and health sectors. A magistrate may hold a warrant for an arrest of a child for 2 weeks, during which time the support team will work with the young person to develop a plan to address their offending at the clinic. This plan can include attendance at education or community programs. And the Marinuka project is having some amazing success, and there is a report that we can provide to you which has outlined that success.
That'd be really good, Tammy.
Justice reinvestment not only makes communities safer and saves children and adults from the horror of being within the criminal justice system, it also makes economic sense. In 2014-15, the Queensland Government spent $89.2 million on detention-based supervision, the second highest expenditure on youth detention in Australia. The cost per child per day in detention on an average day in Queensland is $1,445, which is above the national average. A justice reinvestment approach would instead see a portion of these dollars allocated to addressing the underlying causal factors of offending and preventing children from becoming entrenched in the justice system. Amnesty International welcomed the Queensland Attorney-General's announcement of a justice reinvestment scoping project in Cherbourg in 2017. However, we recommend that the Queensland Government move to make the Cherbourg trial permanent with a long-term funding agreement and seek to trial new sites in other high-risk communities. In its report, Pathways to Justice, the Australian Law Reform Commission recommended that Commonwealth, state and territories provide support for the establishment of an independent justice reinvestment body. It states that the purpose of the body should be to promote the reinvestment of resources from the criminal justice system to community-led, place-based initiatives that address the drivers of crime and incarceration and provide expertise on the implementation of justice reinvestment. Amnesty International has learned from experience working with Indigenous-led organisations that they face issues in writing and applying for funds, governance matters, scalability of their programs and evaluations. A national body could provide advice and expertise on these sorts of matters. On this basis, Amnesty International recommends that the Queensland Government support the establishment of an independent justice reinvestment body where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership and cultural expertise are embedded at all levels. I'd like to finish by talking about the Indigenous-led solutions and alternatives to detention. There is a significant body of evidence, most recently from the Royal Commission into the Protection and Detention of Children in the Northern Territory and the Australian Law Reform Commission, which indicates that for Indigenous people, including children prevention and diversion programs run by Indigenous-led organisations and leaders work best. Report after report has recommended that these programs use a trauma-informed therapeutic approach and that they be locally run, place-based programs and controlled by Indigenous people. Supporting children with therapeutic and culturally appropriate support through Indigenous-led solutions will reduce the likelihood of their entry into the justice system, decrease recidivism rates and set them up to succeed. In this regard, Amnesty International recommends that the Queensland Government increase the allocation of funding Indigenous, community-led and controlled organisations to provide culturally appropriate place-based Indigenous designed and led preventative and diversion programs and rehabilitation programs too, I might add, to address the needs of children at risk of entering the justice system. This funding should be allocated to Indigenous-led organisations and programs in proportion to the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the Queensland justice system. So I'd like to conclude that by addressing the issues related to children on remand and the minimum age of criminal responsibility, and by investing in justice reinvestment and Indigenous-led solutions, the Queensland Government can significantly reduce the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in the justice system, make the community safer and save the taxpayer money. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. That was a refreshing, thoughtful and well-considered presentation. Well done. Mr. Fredericks, do you have a question for Tammy?
Yeah, I've got a number of questions. But, that was a great coverage, Tammy, of a lot of issues there, and just some of those, while I've read the submission, it just highlighted a few things for me in particular around that difference from Axel's around the summative and the other types of offences. But if government was going to set targets in terms of progressing some of the issues around youth, inclusion of Indigenous youth, around incarceration and involvement with the justice system, what kind of targets would you or your organisation like to see? I'm sure you've talked about that in terms of what could be organised, what could be done, what could be set.
Yeah, so Amnesty and the Change the Record Coalition have been lobbying and arguing for targets at a national level for some time, especially in the Close the Gap framework. But also we would like targets at state and territory levels. So the Change the Record Coalition's targets are, one target is to reduce the numbers of people within detention, and another one is to reduce the impact of violence felt by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because quite often the two go hand in hand. So I think you can have subsets of either of those targets, and you could probably also have targets on kids in care, because we know that a lot of the children who end up in the justice system have been wards of the state and have been removed from their families. So there's a number of, we could provide for you some extra information on targets that we've provided. We do have some draft ones we could send to you. And Western Australian Government has recently announced some targets as well, so we could send them to you.
Yep, that would be terrific, Tammy. The other question that I've sort of got is around public appetite or public perceptions around, reinvestment.
Yeah.
And how because I think, in terms of what we know, people are a bit hesitant or see it as a risk, or, there's a range of views on it.
Yeah.
And we'd be interested in your ideas, your organisation's ideas about how, if we put forward things in that regard, what other supporting materials could we use around talking about strategies, around public perceptions around reinvestment?
Yeah, well, this has been really big in America. They've closed juvenile detention centres under a justice reinvestment framework because the children aren't committing crimes anymore. And I think the logic of that makes sense to most people if you can take the time to explain it to them. By investing this money in prevention, we will actually make a safer community and we'll save the taxpayer. So I've actually personally struggled with the fact that it has been so difficult to get Australian governments to be persuaded by justice reinvestment, where it's been so successful elsewhere. So it is hard to get through that tough on crime rhetoric that I think that Australians hold so deeply. We were established as a penal colony. That it's in our psyche. But we have to keep changing the narrative. We have to show people that these kids that get locked up are human beings, that they are vulnerable human beings, that they often have, mental illnesses or FASD, or they come from poverty. We need to show some more compassion, and I think what we need is strong leaders to do that. So if we can have premiers and prime ministers and those in high leadership positions talking about the logic of these programs and how they work and how it will save lives and money and make communities safer, I think that it can work.
Yeah.
Well said.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have you've talked about one or two conventions or treaties that Australia is signatory to early on in your presentation. Yeah. How are we going compared to those commitments we made by signing up to those conventions and or treaties? Does the organisation you represent have a view? Are we honouring the spirit of those treaties we've signed?
Yeah, so yes, Amnesty is involved in the treaty body reporting, and in particular the Universal Periodic Review. I've been to the last two Universal Periodic Reviews, and Australia is not seen so well in the way it's treating Indigenous people in particular. Right. The two issues that kept coming up at the last Universal Periodic Review was to ratify OPCAT, and also which is the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, which will allow the UN to come in and inspect places of detention. and also the way that we're treating refugees in offshore processing. They were really big issues that people were not happy about. With regards to the other conventions, Australia will be reviewed by the Convention on the Rights of the Child this year, and that is delayed. The Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, when she came here, she said that the routine detention of 10 or 11-year-olds was the most distressing part of her visit, and she visited Cleveland Detention Centre. That was the most distressing thing she found about human rights in Australia here. We've been to the UN and done side events. We took some footage from the Dondale Four Corners episode and showed that at the UN, and people were horrified. So, Australia is the age of criminal responsibility. China is 14 and we're 10. So it is being noticed. Australia is continually being criticised for the way that we treat Aboriginal people, in particular in the justice system, but also the way we treat children.
Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you. No.
That's all the questions we have. Are there any comments on the presentation from the floor? Would anybody like to make? Yes. We have a microphone wending its way towards you. There you go.
Just if you state your name, please, Jan, and where you're from, and then your comment.
I'm Jan Hamill from the Collaboration for Alcohol-Related Developmental Disorders. We were formerly the Fetal Alcohol Research Group at UQ Centre for Clinical Research. Tammy, I was really pleased that you raised the issues that you did, and I'll talk about my grandson. You've stolen some of my thunder. He'll be a case history I'll be presenting. But I wanted to make it now in that chronological age of a child at 10 going into does not always equate to the cognitive age. And my little fellow went into the youth detention centre when he was 10. His cognitive age would have been about 3 years of age. Then he went into the big house. I tell people that he might have been a teenager, and my superiors say no, he would have been about 7 or 8 years of age when he went into the big house. He's now going on, he'll be 32 in a couple of months, and he's still inside because he's just been doing that. Anyway, I'll talk about that later, but the remand issue, we need to think about that as a missed opportunity. Now, I don't know what the procedure is when children are admitted on remand, but I know a magistrate in the country recently was concerned about a young woman who was offending, a young adult, and he knew that if he sentenced her and sent her down to the Brisbane Women's Correction Centre, that she would get a full medical on arrival. And that's exactly what they did, and they solved her problem and had her back in the community within days. And I'm wondering if, with the remand centres, the first thing that has to happen is an assessment, a total assessment by a team for cognition, for fetal alcohol or alcohol-related developmental disorders, knowing that dad's drinking status is impacting on the child very much so. And I think that is a missed opportunity. And it would be very good if we could do that. Other missed opportunities are children in court, whereas if you're in the family court, the children have a children's barrister. I'm wondering if that might be, I know that ATSL sent a barrister down to represent the child, but I'm wondering, given the very immature status of the child, should not a children's barrister be there? The other thing is the hearing problems. We've had this problem for decades now with the ENT specialists who continue to say that it's otitis media, glue ear. And of course that is a problem, because we know when you've got dysmorphology of the face and the head, that just as the retinal pathways suffer tortuosity, so do the hearing pathways, but also we know that it's mostly auditory processing. The child's brain, when you say something to the child, it's not that they're not hearing, it's just that they're only picking up 1 or 2 words in every sentence, and you have to repeat the sentences to get the child to understand. So you must keep the sentence simple and just repeat it and repeat it. And I say the magistrates must do this too in the courts, because and then get the young person to repeat the instructions back to them. And that's why the teaching method, direct instructions, is working so well up north in communities, because it's that repetition and it's working with the kids who've got the hearing problems. I wouldn't call it hearing loss because they've never had it to lose it. And the justice reinvestment, I think, is great, although my nephew won't agree with you because he drove through Burke one evening and slowed right down, didn't want to hit a child, and when he got out the other side of town with his road train, he had a couple of slashed tyres. So you know, that was the negative of it. But I know with my kids, they need an external brain 24/7. So if you're going to give them things to do, you have to it has to be daily, it has to be regular, and you have to wear them out so that they do sleep. I mean, somebody has to be there 27, that external brain for them 24/7. So I've looked at a few where there've been so many days a week they will go, and then down here on Sundays at Musgrave Park, there's a very good cultural event on Sundays. But it's only
Jan,
one day.
I'm going to draw
that's-
you to a close, Jan, because I was conscious that someone else had their hand up and that other
Sorry,
people may seek to speak. So can you please pass the microphone over? Thank you. And we are hearing from Dr. Hamill in the next session, so you do have time to present on your ideas. Please state your name and who you're representing today. Keep in mind, please, there is another speaker after you and we're on a time limit. Thank you.
Wayne Sanderson, retired Uniting Church minister and mostly retired clinical psychologist, heavily involved in the Balanced Justice campaign, which has now been operating for over 7 years in Queensland, aimed at reforming the youth justice system of Queensland on an entirely justice reinvestment preventative model. Some success and some frustration, as Tammy has exemplified. I want to make this comment. On the specifically justice reinvestment measures that we've just heard about from Tammy, I've had the great privilege of learning firsthand about some spectacular impacts, very beneficial impacts, from 3 locations on this. I'll detail them very quickly. I won't detail them. I'll indicate.
We don't have time.
Sorry?
We don't have time for you to detail them.
Well, I won't detail them. I'll indicate them very quickly. Dot points. The first is in the Peterborough area of the UK, just out to the north of London. Old, clapped-out industrial sort of place. Not much industry there now. They had the good fortune to have something like Griffiths, what we have here at Griffith, the Pathways to Prevention, operating there over a long time, following a lot of kids, and they've been able to have very helpful interventions to keep kids out of crime and out of court. Secondly, the Seattle area in Washington State in the US, very, very little juvenile crime in that place because over the last 10, 15 years, they've been working very, very resourcefully and insightfully with justice reinvestment. Thirdly and finally, the province of Ontario in Canada. I've been there, I've met the key people, and they're on the graph, their drop in incidents of juvenile crime over about the last 15 years there, because they did a lot of these things, has been... I didn't believe it, frankly. When I first saw it, I thought, I'm not understanding this. There's something awry. But no, it's worth investigating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Please
Mike.
pass the microphone to Nick. We are going to go a little bit over, but I am going to give this time to you, Nick, because people have spoken for a long time. So,
thank you. I'm Nick Takawadi. I work with Work Restart, and I'm also a Centre Care chaplain. In solving our problems, sometimes we introduce one measure to fix a problem, and in the process, create another problem. I want to refer specifically to the age of criminal responsibility. In moving it from 10 to 14, I just want to make not a question, but just a comment to highlight that there is a real need to make sure that by moving that, it does not create a situation which delays necessary intervention at an earlier age, which has been recommendations from other proposals. That if that succeeds, that the age is moved to 14, that in that process it is necessary to make sure that there are other nets or ways of intervening with young children at an earlier age, because it is a challenge. She mentioned people who are, say, 10, but maybe three years cognitive. I have interacted with men who are 50, probably at a cognitive of maybe 13, in that they do not take responsibility for what is happening to them. It is the other guy, or it is the system, it is something else, but that responsibility is failed to come.
Thanks,
thank
Nick.
you, Nick. That was great.
It's a good, useful comment. I'm sure there's a way to accommodate that, but it's thanks for putting it on the record.
Can I respond?
Tammy, please respond if you feel on that. Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, there are many countries around the world that have a much higher age of criminal responsibility to Australia, and you know, their nations haven't collapsed. There are so many ways around the world that we can look to as to how we can work with children under the age of 14 who might present in ways that show that they need help. It is a cry for help, and so I agree with you. There does need to be programs put in place, and that's why we're arguing for Indigenous-led programs and things like justice reinvestment, which will address those underlying causal factors. And I just wanted to pick up one point about your language and a lot of other people's language about early intervention. We try not to use the word intervention too much because interventions have been used historically to deny Aboriginal people's rights. The Northern Territory intervention is a very good example. We prefer to talk about prevention and diversion. So I just don't think we need to always think that the answer is to intervene in a life of an Aboriginal family and pluck that kid out. You know, it might be supporting the families more. You know, we need to change the way we're thinking about things so that we are supporting those families and those children with whatever issues are presenting.
Tammy, thank you. Strong presentation. We appreciate you making the time, and I think we'll be the better for hearing you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy.